I often noticed that if an anecdote, or a quotation, much more a lively discussion, was going forward, he would, if busy with the fire or the curtains, the lamp or the tea, find a pretext for remaining in the room till the point should be reached. If his purpose was to catch it, you weren't discreet. You were, in fact, scarce human, to call him off. And I shall never forget a look, a hard, stony stare. I caught it in his passage, which one day, when there were a good many people in the room, he fastened upon the footman who was helping him in the service, and who, in an undertone, had asked him some irrelevant question. It was only the first manifestation of harshness I ever observed on Brooksmith's part, and I at first wondered what was the matter. Then I became conscious that Mr. Offord was relating a very curious anecdote, never before perhaps made so public, and imparted to the narrator by an eye-witness of the fact, bearing on Lord Byron's life in Italy. Nothing would induce me to reproduce it here, but Brooksmith had been in danger of losing it. If I ever should venture to reproduce it, I shall feel how much I lose in not having my fellow auditor to refer to. The first day Mr. Offord's door was closed was therefore a dark date in contemporary history. It was raining hard, and my umbrella was wet. But Brooksmith received it from me exactly as if this were a preliminary for going upstairs. I observed, however, that instead of putting it away, he held it poised and trickling over the rug, and I then became aware that he was looking at me with deep acknowledging eyes, his air of universal responsibility. I immediately understood. There was scarce need of question and answer as they passed between us. When I took in that our good friend had given up, as never before, though only for the occasion, I exclaimed dolefully, "What a difference it will make! And to how many people?" "I shall be one of them, sir," said Brooksmith, and that was the beginning of the end. Mr. Offord came down again, but the spell was broken, the great sign being that the conversation was for the first time not directed. It wandered and stumbled, a little frightened, like a lost child. It had let go the nurse's hand.
"The worst of it is now that we shall talk about my health. C'est la fin de tout,"
Mr. Offord said when he reappeared, and then I recognized what a note of change that would be, for he had never tolerated anything so provincial. We ran to each other's health as little as to the daily weather. The talk became ours, in a word, not his, and as ours, even when he talked, it could only be inferior. In this form it was a distress to Brooksmith, whose attention now wandered from it altogether. He had so much closer a vision of his master's intimate conditions than our superficialities represented. There were better hours, and he was more in and out of the room, but I could see that he was conscious of the decline, almost of the collapse, of our great institution. He seemed to wish to take counsel with me about it, to feel responsible for its going on in some form or other. When, for the second period, the first had lasted several days, he had to tell me that his employer didn't receive, I half expected to hear him say, after a moment, "Do you think I ought to, sir, in his place?" As he might have asked me, with the return of autumn, if I had thought he had better light the drawing-room fire. He had a resigned philosophic sense of what his guests, our guests, as I came to regard them in our colloquies, would expect. His feeling was that he wouldn't absolutely approve of himself as a substitute for Mr. Offord, but he was so saturated with the religion of habit that he would have made, for our friends, the necessary sacrifice to the divinity. He would take them on a little further, till they could look about them. I think I saw him also mentally confronted with the opportunity to deal, for once in his life, with some of his own dumb preferences, his limitations of sympathy, weeding a little in prospect, and returning to a purer tradition. It was not unknown to me that he considered that toward the end of our host's career a certain laxity of selection had crept in. At last it came to be the case that we all found the closed door more often than the open one. But even when it was closed, Brooksmith managed to crack for me to squeeze through. So that practically I never turned away without having paid a visit. The difference simply came to be that the visit was to Brooksmith. It took place in the hall, at the familiar foot of the stairs, and we didn't sit down. At least Brooksmith didn't. Moreover, it was devoted wholly to one topic, and always had the air of being already over, beginning, so to say, at the end. But it was always interesting. It always gave me something to think about. It's true that the subject of my meditation was ever the same. Ever, "It's all very well, but what will become of Brooksmith?" Even my private answer to this question left me still unsatisfied. No doubt Mr. Offord would provide for him. But what would he provide? That was the great point. He couldn't provide society, and society had become a necessity of Brooksmith's nature. I must add that he never showed a symptom of what I may call sordid solicitude, anxiety on his own account. He was rather livid and intensely grave, as befitted a man before whose eyes the shade of that which once was great was passing away. He had the solemnity of a person winding up, under depressing circumstances, a long-established and celebrated business. He was a kind of social executor, or liquidator. But his manner seemed to testify exclusively to the uncertainty of our future. I couldn't, in those days, have afforded it. I lived in 2 rooms in Jermyn Street, and didn't keep a man. But even if my income had permitted, I shouldn't have ventured to say to Brooksmith, emulating Mr. Offord, "My dear fellow, I'll take you on." The whole tone of our intercourse was so much more an implication that it was I who should now want a lift. Indeed, there was a tacit assurance in Brooksmith's whole attitude that he should have me on his mind. One of the most assiduous members of our circle had been Lady Kenyon, and I remember his telling me one day that her ladyship had, in spite of her own infirmities, lately much aggravated, been in person to inquire. In answer to this, I remarked that she would feel it more than anyone. Brooksmith had a pause before saying, in a certain tone, there's no reproducing some of his tones, "I'll go and see her." I went to see her myself, and learned he had waited on her. But when I said to her, in the form of a joke, but with a core of earnest, that when all was over some of us ought to combine to club together and set Brooksmith up on his own account, she replied, a trifle disappointingly, "Do you mean in a public house?" I looked at her in a way I think Brooksmith himself would have approved, and then I answered, "Yes, the Offord Arms." What I had meant, of course, was that for the love of art itself we ought to look to it that such a peculiar faculty and so much acquired experience shouldn't be wasted. I really think that if we had caused a few black-edged cards to be struck off and circulated, "Mr. Brooksmith will continue to receive on the old premises from 4 to 7. Business carried on as usual during the alterations," the greater number of us would have rallied. Sometimes he took me upstairs, always by his own proposal, and our dear old friend, in bed, in a curious flowered and brocaded cassac, which made him, especially as his head was tied up in a handkerchief to match, look, to my imagination, like the dying Voltaire, held for 10 minutes a sadly shrunken little salon. I felt indeed each time as if I were attending the last coucher of some social sovereign. He was royally whimsical about his sufferings, and not at all concerned, quite as if the Constitution provided for the case about his successor. He glided over our sufferings charmingly, and none of his jokes. It was a gallant abstention, some of them would have been so easy, were at our expense. Now and again, I confess, there was one at Brooksmith's, but so pathetically sociable as to make the excellent man look at me in a way that seemed to say, "Do exchange a glance with me, or I shan't be able to stand it." What he wasn't able to stand was not what Mr. Offord said about him, but what he wasn't able to say in return. His idea of conversation for himself was giving you the convenience of speaking to him, and when he went to see Lady Kenyon, for instance, it was to carry her the tribute of his receptive silence. Where would the speech of his betters have been if proper service had been a manifestation of sound? In that case the fundamental difference would have had to be shown by their dumbness, and many of them, poor things, were dumb enough without that provision. Brooksmith took an unfailing interest in the preservation of the fundamental difference. It was the thing he had most on his conscience. What had become of it, however, when Mr. Offord passed away, like any inferior person, was relegated to the eternal stillness after the manner of a butler above stairs. His aspect on the event, for the several successive days, may be imagined, and the multiplication by funereal observance of the things he didn't say. When everything was over, it was late the same day, I knocked at the door of the house of mourning, as I so often had done before. I could never call on Mr. Offord again, but I had come literally to call on Brooksmith. I wanted to ask him if there was anything I could do for him, painted with vagueness as this inquiry could only be. My presumptuous dream of taking him into my own service had died away. My service wasn't worth his being taken into. My offer could only be to help him find another place, and yet there was an indelicacy, as it were, in taking for granted that his thoughts would immediately be fixed on another. I had a hope that he would be able to give his life a different form, though certainly not the form, the frequent result of such bereavements, of his setting up a little shop. That would have been dreadful, for I should have wished to forward any enterprise he might embark in. Yet how could I have brought myself to go and pay him shillings and take back coppers over a counter? My visit then was simply an intended compliment. He took it as such, gratefully, and with all the tact in the world. He knew I really couldn't help him, and that I knew he knew I couldn't. But we discussed the situation, with a good deal of elegant generality, at the foot of the stairs, in the hall already dismantled, where I had so often discussed other situations with him. The executors were in possession, as was still more apparent when he made me pass for a few minutes into the dining-room, where various objects were muffled up for removal. Two definite facts, however, he had to communicate, one being that he was to leave the house for ever that night. Servants, for some mysterious reason, seem always to depart by night, and the other, he mentioned it only at the last, and with hesitation, that he was already aware his late master had left him a legacy of £80. "I'm very glad," I said, and Brooksmith was of the same mind. "It was so like him to think of me." That was all that passed between us on the subject, and I know nothing of his judgment of Mr. Offord's memento. £80 are always £80, and no one has ever left me an equal sum. But all the same, for Brooksmith, I was disappointed. I don't know what I had expected, but it was almost a shock. £80 might stock a small shop, a very small shop. But, I repeat, I couldn't bear to think of that. I asked my friend if he had been able to save a little, and he replied, "No, sir, I've had to do things." I didn't inquire what things they might have been. They were his own affair, and I took his word for them as assentingly as if he had had the greatness of an ancient house to keep up, especially as there was something in his manner that seemed to convey a prospect of farther sacrifice.